Good evening, buonasera a tutti. Parleremo in inglese per interloquire con i nostri colleghi negli Stati Uniti e in Olanda, però chi vuole poi potrà seguire c'è un canale Zoom in italiano e i nostri tecnici Lorenzo Mosna hanno messo in sovraimpressione il link che ho già dimenticato, go.yulm / qualcos'altro. Comunque lo trovate in sovraimpressione. So, welcome. We should have connected James McAdams from United States. We can see in the monitor, Lorenzo. Okay. Hi, James.
Okay.
And also,
okay.
I welcome here in Milan, and that it's the editor of the book together with Monta, and we also have connected with us Eric Zolo from Stony Brook, and in some moments Carmen Elena Telles, she's a composer from Venezuela that worked for a very long time in the United States. So we will start this evening. We titled this evening After the Wave, talking about transnational connection between Europe and Latin America, because they all started some years ago, I think 3 years ago, if I remember well, in Notre Dame University in Indiana, in the United States, when James McAdams was so interested in building a big conference with different voices about the idea of 68, the idea of long 68, the connection about the idea of revolution, to confront this particular age of the end of the 60s and the starting of the 70s with all the changes in the politic side, in the Imaginaries, in the technical of communication, confronting ideas, confronting experience with historians coming, expert of Oriental Europe, Central Europe, Occidental Europe, Italy in my case, and Latin Americanists coming from Argentina, like Valeria Manzano, Uruguay, Mexico, like Jaime Pensado, and many others. But the original idea of James was also not only have historians, as usual in historical congresses, but invite people that in one side can be considered testimony directly coming, experimenting that age, and on the other side are people that through different languages of communication reflected about the changing between the 60s and the 70s, like for example, Volker Schlondorf, that is another of our guests this evening, that is a big director, the author of important movies like Il Tamburo di Latta, I don't know the original English name or German name of the movie, that won the Cannes Festival, and or some other big, is also an Oscar Prize winner. So welcome, Volker, that I can see you now.
Yeah, welcome.
Hi, Volker.
Happy I made it. I couldn't get access to Zoom.
Okay, sorry for this strange connection. You are in Amsterdam, right?
I'm in Hamburg.
In Hamburg, so I
Yeah, but things change.
Okay, and you are working on your last movie.
Right.
Okay. So the organization of the evening will be in this. We will start talking about the book with two discussants. We have two different perspectives. We have Gerd Reinerhorn, that is a colleague from an historian that worked in Sciences Po, before in French and now in Belgium. And yes, okay.
Still in France.
Still in France. You are still in Paris. Okay. And he's German, and we also have an anthropologist, this Franco Lacecla, that is an Italian, but that work a lot with Ivan Illich, an important person in these changes of the decades between the 60s and the 70s, and who is a very big expert of the global connection changing during the last part of the 20th century and in this first part of the 21st century. So we will start with the two discussants that we'll talk about the book, our book, and then we'll invite to talk Volker, James, and Eric, and Carmen, Elena. So, Gert, can we start with you?
Well, if you insist, then I will gladly start. Thank you very much. Thanks for the chance to actually be on the campus of Ulm, which I have never been to. Let me launch into it because we only have so much time. I have not read every single page of the book because I haven't actually seen the book yet, other than the electronic copy, and I'm from the generation that still prefers paper over virtual reality. Nonetheless, I have seen enough of it to know that I'm convinced actually that this is going to be a modern classic rather soon, because it is one of the very few, really the only book I can think of which consistently tries to focus on two parts of the world, on the complex issue of 68 or Il 68, Europe and Latin America. And I like that focus because, it's not a sole focus on, in quotation marks, just Europe, although Europe is big enough and diverse enough. But it's also not an attempt to cover the entire world, which some books try to do, and it usually falls flat because, you can't really cover the entire world, all 6 continents in one book. So let me, having said this, let me focus on a couple of points rather than making a few generalities. I wanted to pick up certain points. And let me comment, for one thing, on the subtitle of the book, Cultural Revolutions in Europe and Latin America, as it could easily be misinterpreted, I think, to suggest that cultural revolutions were all that the 1960s were all about. And the introductory chapter suggests, I cite, that scholarship on the 1960s has gravitated towards a much broader treatment of 1968 as a possible cultural revolution, referencing, above all else, Arthur Marwick. And the idea there is that the more far-flung political and institutional challenges to society associated with global 1968 never materialized in the end. Rather than to focus on ultimately unsuccessful challenges to the socio-political status quo, observers should keep the eye on the prize of what did actually happen. What did actually happen almost everywhere, a massive shift in cultural attitudes and experiences. And let me cite one of the key phrases in Arthur Marwick's inspirational magnum opus, which remains a landmark to this day. I cite, "There was no economic revolution, no political revolution, no advent of the proletariat to power, no classless society, no destruction of mainstream culture, no obliteration of language," full stop. Now, when you really look at the fine print, you will see that he actually also targets cultural revolutions as something that didn't really happen to the great extent, but most people take him to suggest, which is what Arthur Marwick himself says many times throughout his book, that he was, in my view, one of the key proponents of the notion that to understand 68, you have to focus on cultural revolutions. Okay, yes, of course, taken at face value, Marwick is absolutely right. As I myself have repeatedly said on various occasions, it would be preposterous to deny that it would be preposterous to deny the veracity of a cultural revolution occurring sometime between the 1960s and the 1970s. So yes, the so-called 60s brought about massive cultural changes, but I would like to add also far more. For despite Hegel, the great German philosopher, not everything that is real is also rational. And the most truly radical potential of 1968 lay precisely in the highlighting of the possibilities of a different organization of social life. 1968 pointed the finger at the existence of historical alternatives to dominant patterns of politics, the organization of production, and the shaping of modern culture. Not only in that sense, but also in that sense, the 1960s, to me, were much more than 1, 2, 3 many cultural revolutions. Let me begin by addressing some aspects of these very real cultural revolutions, which the various contributions to this excellent volume are all about. And let me look specifically at the connections and interactions between culture and revolution. Two key words in any serious account of 1968, as all the authors in this volume would no doubt agree with. Eric Drott begins his stimulating gaze at a revolutionary time and the belatedness of music in 1968 with a paraphrase of a key insight by Louis-Jean Calvet, who, I cite Drott, Eric Drott here, who observed that during periods of revolutionary upheaval, people seldom sing songs born of the movement. End of citation. Each major revolt, they argue, produces protest songs, but they do not necessarily make it into contemporaneous popular culture and consciousness. Who amongst this audience here today, whether live or via electronic social distancing, who, for instance, has ever heard of Colette Magny or Dominique Grange? Yet, they were probably the two, in 1968, most well-known rebel musical poets in France. I once more quote from Eric Drott's text. Far from representing a radical break, far from unleashing the pent-up creative energies of the masses, watershed events like May 68 tend to be characterized instead by a return to the familiar, to learned repertoires of political and artistic action. End of quote. Is that really always so? Question mark. Now, as in all good edited volumes, alternative points of view, all contained within the same volume, are quick to temper any specific observations in other chapters of the book. Patrice McSherry furnishes, perhaps, the most direct counterpoint to the thesis advanced by Louis-Jean Calvet. Patrice McSherry, dramatically underscores that the Chilean New Song movement managed not only to create a new musical genre, but it made powerful inroads into popular culture and politics in the late 60s and even more so in the early 1970s. I cite from Patrice McSherry a short, sweet sentence. Thus, Chile is a particularly rich case study of intertwined revolutions in music and politics. End of quote. The Chilean New Song movement was born of the popular struggles in Chile in the 1960s for land reform, university reform, control of resources, social inclusion, and deeper democratization. During this period, culture was democratized. Masses of people became involved in new forms of popular music, dance, graphic and mural art, literature, and theater. Artists and musicians were a vibrant and integral component of the social transformations taking place. This was another citation from Patrice McSherry. In other words, this is me speaking, art became an integral part of the daily practices of popular culture in Chile for more than half a dozen years. Where prolonged mass social movements take root, culture is rarely far behind, sometimes ahead. New social struggles and political protest movements organically result in cultural innovations. The creative energies of the masses are not at all averse to innovations in such historical moments of crisis and opportunity. Now, does this mean that Louis-Jean Calvet is necessarily all wrong? No. But to explain the seemingly strange gap between politics and music in the French May events, it is perhaps more important to take a close look at the historical context rather than to postulate new socio-psychological hypotheses. For, let me rain on the parade, when placed in a comparative context, the French May, and please forgive me for this frankness, was not only a social explosion heard around the world, but also on another level of analysis, a flash in the pan. Yes, for 3 to 6 weeks, up to 7.5 or maybe even 10 million French workers, blue and white collar alike, went on a general strike, and an elevated willingness to protest, a valiant French tradition, remained part of French political culture for some years thereafter, all the way until today. But I invite members of this audience to compare the French May with, for instance, Italy's creeping May, the Maggio Sriciante. Italy never experienced a month-long general strike, even during the hot autumn of 1969. But the level of worker mobilization, blue and white collar alike, remained on an incredibly high level, not just for 6 weeks, but for 6 years. Between 1969 and 1974, Italian factory and office floors often remained literally ungovernable, leading to countless near-permanent ulcers for managerial personnel. The line speed in Fordist Italian factories was no longer controlled by the administrative hierarchy and engineers, but by trade unions and, best of all, the workforce itself. So perhaps the real reason why rebel music was sidelined in the French May was the fact that the social struggles of the relatively brief French May did not lead to a sustained involvement of the average French. Whereas in Italy, just like in Chile, in the earlier example, the years-long social and political regime crisis did lead to profound changes in the socio-psychological and cultural outlook of many Italians, at least for some years. Such a massive socio-political and cultural revolution ultimately, for instance, catapulted the iconoclastic playwright and actor Dario Fo to pole position in the world of revolutionary art, making him into, I quote from one of his biographers, arguably the most widely performed contemporary playwright in world theater and the winner of the 1979 Nobel Prize for Literature. And to return to the world of music, Ivan de la Mea, Alfredo Bandelli, and Paolo Pietrangelo, led more prominent lives in those heady days of the long 60s than their French counterparts, Colette Mani and Dominique Grange. Perhaps the fact that the French musical rebels were women had something to do with their relative invisibility as well, of course, but that is yet another story. What I'm saying, and I'm trying to conclude here, is that culture and deep-going social and political revolution have been intimately intertwined in global 1968. By no means everywhere, but nonetheless often enough to be a phenomenon to be taken extremely seriously. So what makes it then that the notion of il 68 is often associated with a mere, in quotation marks, cultural revolution? As I have already hinted at, it has everything to do with the simple and undeniable fact that the long 60s were not experienced everywhere as a multi-class social explosion. There were plenty of cases where les années 68 stopped short of that. But the counterexamples are too prominent to be overlooked. Valeria Manzana reminds us in her chapter on Argentina that a powerful multi-class upheaval was certainly part of the Argentinian 1969, which is of course the Argentinian 68. Timothy Ryback recalls, amongst other things, what we all take for granted, that is that the Prague Spring in 1968 was a society-wide rejection of the status quo, not a mere cultural revolt limited to select social milieus. Thus, the focus on cultural revolution, whether in the singular or the plural, is certainly one of the key strengths of this volume. And I can only urge this audience to partake in the breadth of the many examples admirably described and analyzed in this book. But let us not unduly detract from the depth of the socio-political challenges which also characterized a number of highly visible cases in what was global 1968. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gerd Reiner. So Gerd is a comparative historian in European cases because he studied French, German, Italian cases, so he can relate with a wide open analysis. But an interesting part of this book is related to the transatlantic connections that were built in this age. Obviously, talking about cultural revolution, we speak also about a category that the Chinese Revolution of '66 has marked and that was in many ways not understood completely by the European actors of the '68 in its complexity and radicalism. But I think that the real news of this age is the transatlantic connection and the rediscovering of the other America, as Father Turoldo, another actor of these ages in Italy, called it. Because if you think it's the first time that for European young people there are idols coming from extra-European areas, like Ernesto Che Guevara, for example, that will be transformed, as we have seen in the Global History course, into from the guerrillero héroe popular to the communist transformation of his images to a global actor of revolutionary issues, sometimes schematizing or with a lot of different understanding of the complexity of this of his personality. So a lot of connection were related also with the Catholic Church, with the crashes, the changes. We have to think that in the '60s we are experimenting changing in the U.S. strategy with respect of Latin American that in some way is connected with Europe. And there is a deep transformation inside the Catholic Church with the council and the impact of the council in Latin America, the new missionarities, etc., etc. So it's interesting to cross barrier, to have with us not only historian but also an anthropologist like Franco that knew Latin American areas also, and not only also Pacific and other parts of the world, but with a deep knowing, especially of the Andean and Amazonican part of the Ecuador and other area of Latin America. So I let him the microphone.
Thank you, Massimo. I'm trying to, I don't know what I'm going to say. So this is what I must introduce my attempt to make some kind of thinking, anthropological thinking about the 68, and then I will go back to this idea of transatlantic and Catholics. And so, I mean, my first hypothesis, and this is what I'm in a way addressing to the people here, so that are, nobody among you has ever lived the 68, I think, no? I was there. I was occupying the university in Palermo in the 68. I was the first year of architecture, so I was living there, and then I spent some time in France. So it's I was partly a witness of what was going on. Anyway, the first question that is an hypothesis that I embrace, that I am addressing to you, is the idea that in a way 68 was an anthropological big shift. I mean, just because in the 68 there were so many young people, many more than today. So the generation that had 20 years, that was 18, 19, in the 68, more or less all over the world, was the generation after the war. It was the generation that was really, was the boom generation, were the generation that in a way found themselves in an old world. So this is something that is very important to remind. So you have an amazing number of young people that is totally overwhelming the other generations, and these young people, that were really many, tried to change the context where they were living. So I mean, in a way, I'm not trying to have a Malthusian reading of the history, but in a way this is very important because it is something that happens many times in history. So looking at, for instance, the Spring Revolution in the Middle East, no, in the Arabian countries, you have something very similar. So you have a new generation of young people that doesn't accept the system that the previous generation had settled. So I mean, in this sense, in order to understand the 68, you have to put yourself in a situation that doesn't exist anymore, because today you are the minority of the society. So you have to imagine that what is the meaning of being the majority of society. And you are the majority of a society in which the leading person of the society are not young people. So this is the big, so under this point of view, as an anthropologist, for me this is very important. And this also explains many of the things that happened afterwards. No, I can, and this is a really, someone can be very angry about this kind of reading of lecture that this kind of screening that I'm doing of those years. What happened just afterwards was the attempt to recover this huge wave through old thoughts, through old institutions, through all the system of thinking. You know, even the Marxism in the 68 was totally, was out of date. So what happens in the 68 is that there is an attempt just after the 68 to canalize, no, to channel the wave through the idea of revolution that was the idea of of the generation before the Second War. So in a way, the attempt to read.
Interrupt you, I'm very sorry, but I've been trying technical support. I can't hear almost anything.
Okay.
The picture is excellent, but the
But-
sound, even though with sound ears, just doesn't come across.
Okay. Okay, maybe I can talk much closer. Maybe is that better?
It's better.
Okay. Okay. Sorry. So the okay. So in a way, what I'm trying to say is that in order to understand the 68, you have to understand the amazing context of having a world in which the young generation were the majority. No. I have a very strong memory of something that happened to me in the 70s when I went to for the first time to Zagreb. No, Zagreb was still in the, let's say, East communist area, more or less a socialist area. And what was striking me is that the young people in Zagreb were singing John Lennon. And I was really, astounded because I say, why people here sings John Lennon? Because, in Italy at the same time, this was the beginning of the 70s, John Lennon didn't have the same meaning. So was a good, was part of the Beatles, was a good singer, but nobody was identifying John Lennon as a kind of guru of the change, no? So, what I'm trying to say is that in a way, the 68 is the incoming of the idea of a different life that is very, very strongly connected with the big shift of generation. So there is more a kind of libertarian, very, a strong idea that the most important thing is really to make love, or to just to get stoned, or just to have fun. So this idea that was even strong in Germany and in France. That we are not here in order to follow the trade unions or the new leaders. So if you think about the Cohn-Bendit was never a Marxist. No, was more a kind of anarchist, libertarian thinker. And the strong part of this story is that nobody was really the guru of this wave. Because the guru was the new thinking that was just coming out of the idea of being young people that were under a system that they didn't recognize at all. So, in this sense, even the Catholic part, so even Ivan Illich, that was a person that I've been working with for 20 years, he was much more inspired in the States by Paul Goodman, by the anarchist thinking, than the Catholic thinking. So the idea is, okay, let's try to liberate people in their daily life, and not just to free the workers, to free. So of course this was happening at the same time. Of course there was a workers' movement, but then what was really terrible for me that I lived those years was the crazy attempt of the institutions, even if we are thinking of parties, of communist parties, of Maoist parties, of Marxist parties, to in a way to to take advantage of this wave, no? And this was really a very strong thing, no? In a way, if you think at the bad way in which everything has ended, the idea of even the idea of violence, the idea of the armed fight, this was not part of the wave, because even in the way there was so much of the idea of, for instance, a non-violent world. There was more Martin Luther King than the Red Brigades, or the Red Fraction. So this is something that has been, I think, really erased in the memory, wiped away. So that, that big wave was possible because there was an anthropological amazing revolution. That was really the idea that you couldn't, it was enough. You couldn't really stand anymore those old people in the room of power. So and this is really something very strong to be thought about. Coming to trying to read the 68 from the perspective of today. For instance, it's very funny. The word revolution that at those times was, if you could just say revolution, you were a singer, you were a painter, you were, and revolution was the keyword, was we have to make, today is really ridiculous if you think about the absolutely meaningless contain of the word revolution. What is revolution? Nobody knows. It's and it's very funny that the only word that in the last few years has become another kind of keyword is capitalism. And this, under my point of view, is also an anthropological shift. So we have fallen, in a way, in a new economic ideology in which the question is how to demolish capitalism, not how to free ourselves. So once again, is the old world that is coming back. And when I say the old world, I put everything together. So the Marxist, the post-Marxist, the Antonio Negri and his reading. If you think of this crazy thing that Tony Negri is using a category that was very strong in the 60s, was the category of commons. And he's totally defacing this category. He's using as a strange, il comune, that has no meaning. The idea of putting things together, the idea of that are things that you cannot sell, that is the idea that is at the real basis also of Illich thinking, because most of the work of Ivan Illich was about the idea that societies keep always a level that is not exploitable, that you cannot sell. That is a level in which people, in a way, build their own daily life and try to protect it from the use, not only of the capitalist, but also the anti-capitalist. That there is a zone that you can declare free. Say, okay, this is the zone. He was calling it vernacular, but anyway, this idea that society are able to keep an area that is an area of creativity, self-determination, self-definition. So this was very strong. And today we are in a totally mess because under my point of view, according to my point of view, we are really just because we are so few, because young people are a minority, we are again under the domain of the elders, under the domain of those who has never been able to create new categories. So the big disaster of '68 is the totally collapse of new ideas that were not identifiable, that you couldn't identify with some special, no, guru or thinker or no, but really that was more you could identify more in the behavior of the young people, in the way in which young people were trying to define their world. You know, and I find that this is also the reason why, for instance, the States and Latin America have been so powerful on Europe, because I mean, this idea was very strong in the States, because the States had more a radical liberal libertarian tradition than a Marxist one. And even in Latin America, I mean, I think for the history and the character of people, no, Marxism was something very much changed by the way in which people were thinking about society. So I mean, and really, what is amazing for me is that today everything has been mixed together. It's very difficult to tell, no, one movement from another. You know, the history I'm telling is a history that happened just a few years after the '68. So this attempt to recover everything, you know, to put everything in the old boxes. So this is, anyway, this is just, you know, I announced that I didn't know what I was going to say. So it's.
So, thank you, Franco. I think before this this presentation, I listened a very interesting presentation with our colleague Mingardi about nationalism, and some analysis about the idea of nationalism that was really interesting, with deep reflections. And I think that the other big category that we can find in this complex passage between the 60s and the 70s, the transnational category that enter with a strongness never experimented before at various levels. Imaginaries, musical, as was said, the Beatles that change with Indian inflections and transform the old rock and roll imitation in something that it's creating a new patchwork of different experiments, etc., etc. And obviously the political transformation of the passage of the decades concern also a big transformation inside the categories of the Cold War, obviously, and the schemes of the Cold War that were experimented during the last part of the 30s and during the 50s and the first part of the 60s. So I don't know if Eric is connected. I can see him, but I would like to give the floor to Volker. Volker is one of the greatest European directors. He worked in Germany, in France, in the United States, also in Mexico, if I remember well, with Louis Malle. So what do you think about this transformation of the horizons, of the world of horizons during these passages between the 60s and the 70s, in your personal experience and in your collective ideas of the changing world of that age?
I'm afraid I can't really answer your question as no thing as with Franco. I can hardly hear anything. Of volume, but there's such strong the pictures are excellent, always good. But the sound has such strong interference in the hotel so I really could not follow the debate so far. Just yes. I'm afraid that may not be that I can only just want to confirm that I don't know, but still different meaning, different expression, but yet they were all kind of animated by this need for change. It was an urgency that had accumulated during the 50s, I guess. As far as I'm concerned, the first signs were very early cutting their hair in Germany and doing long hair in the West, I suppose. Listening and Bob Dylan came up and songs came up. Uh, that level, I think, I experienced before. Yeah. Took care of it. Ah, now the sound interference went. So maybe next conference I can hear you better.
Now we can hear you better.
You cut short there. Now it's back again. Perhaps. I only have high pitched sound, but as long as you hear me, so that is a fact we all experience in our bodies, this need for change, change moving, in my case, at age 70 or in Germany to France, with no other aim but change, change country, change culture, whatever, but not continue the way we had grown up individually. That was, I think, the common denominator. And now, when people say, well, what about today? What I can say, there is a profound unhappiness. I was just spent 2 weeks in Mexico at UNAM teaching. Now I'm in Hamburg. I move around a lot, and I feel wherever I meet the younger generation that they are kind of unhappy, but without any elan, without any whatever project or even maybe urge to revolt. And I think in our case, the revolt almost preceded the necessity to revolt. So in hindsight, I understand 68 even less, but I bless it even more.
Thank you very much, Volker. Now can you hear us? No? Zero. So I give the floor to James McAdams. I don't know if Carmen Elena is connected. Spento. Hi, James.
Sound's gone, so
Okay.
for a while. Extraordinary.
No, what I did, I tell you, maybe I caused it. I pushed the button on the mic of technical assistance, and all of a sudden the sound got crystal clear.
Perfect.
It's one of the great ironies of all the technology we have in this world today. So, first of all, I want to start with, Volker's point, which was so poetic at the end and beautiful about the 68 then and the younger generation today. Because it's true, they don't really have a project. They don't have an agenda. I mean, you hear some of the ideas out there, but you don't feel this strong sense of moral compulsion that existed 50 years ago. And alas, and I think that's partly because what we older people have done with the one or two generations after 1968, we've encouraged people to become, young people to become producers, oriented towards making products, and then evaluating them in various meritocratic criteria. And so for them to survive, not only physically, materially, but also intellectually, they feel like they just have to go about their business. second thing that was important for us to accomplish in this book was to make a contribution and not just to have another one of many books and conferences on 1968, 50 years afterward. That would be too easy. And so what we aspire to do were at least two major things. First of all, to focus on cases that were not the stereotype cases in the study of 1968. So classic works on 68 always emphasized the United States. And as an American, I felt it was a good time to just take the United States out of the picture and reflect on other parts of the world. And it turns out, as we would all agree, that what happened in other parts of the world was every bit as important as developments in the United States. And we actually had, it's back, but I'll continue. Now it's gone again. The other thing that I'd emphasize here just about our regional focus is it's really three regions and not just two. First of all, it is absolutely unique, and this is one of the reasons that I hope the book will get translated into Italian and Spanish and French and so forth. Absolutely unique in that we include Latin America, because it has been so simple for people to just kind of not cover Latin America, or to the extent that it's been done, to include Latin America in these omnibus volumes in which you have totally, incomparable cases like China in the 1960s. So we wanted to focus on Latin America, but we also brought in another region, often neglected, which is East Central Europe, the Soviet bloc. And of course, the experiences are both very different in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. But we also asked repeatedly, how are they similar? And as Volker was saying, there certainly was a similar spirit at this time in many respects, and not necessarily in specific ways, but in the sense that there was an openness to look at the world in new ways in this period, to exchange ideas, to imagine things that had previously seemed unimaginable or maybe hadn't even occurred to people, so that there was this opening to intellectual, artistic, musical, photographic expression in experimentation that hadn't been the case before. Which then brings me to the second thing we tried to do, which is, as we've heard, to focus on culture. Culture, of course, is a very broad term. It's hard to pin down, justifiably so. But we didn't want to make this a book about politics. And so many of I'm a political scientist, but so many of the books on 68 ultimately become about politics and political organizations, political struggles, protests, all of which are important, but exclude the other crucial aspects of this period. And so how to do that? Well, what we did is we invited people like Volker Schlendorf, one of the great filmmakers today, but we also invited musicologists, people who are experts in photography, obviously Massimo, people who studied the Vatican, Vatican II, and the Church, and so forth, so we could get present a fuller and more original, I think, perspective on how to interpret this period. And I think we succeeded, and I would say, again, because of the collaborative nature of the project. Now, some quick comments here on the generous remarks of our commentators. I think that Gerd Reiner has identified a crucial point, and that is the relationship between cultural change, the receptivity to new ideas and expressions, and social conditions. And he describes it as a kind of dialectic in which social change allows for the expression of new ideas. And he makes the particularly important point that because social change occurs at a different pace and in different ways, therefore, the ability of these ideas to take fruit, gain expression, and be sustained is shaped by the nature of the social changes at the time. And I think it's absolutely right because we can look at different countries and see why different conditions either facilitated or didn't facilitate sustained cultural experimentation. However, I would also say this, and this occurred to me in listening to both of our commentators. I think it's crucial. First of all, as Eric Drott points out in his chapter, cultural change doesn't take place in 24 hours. It could take place over decades. And we're seeing that, and the contributors testify to this in their chapters, that certain ideas, certain approaches, a certain skeptical attitude about the reality or the establishment have changed over time. Sometimes in a disappointing, slow way, and then if I can violate my rule about the United States, I will say that I do find among my students that it has been much easier for them to be respective to be more open-minded about subjects like gay rights, for example, than ever would have been the case. I think without the cultural revolutions of 1968. And so, here I come to this point about the young. Absolutely right. You can't, you're not going to have a revolution like this without the young, and that has always been the case. Revolutionaries come from the youth, and going back hundreds of years, it's clear. But there was something important, and here I'm bringing in Gerhard Reiner's point again, that the constellation of 1968 around the world, but particularly in our regions, was possible because of the convergence of different social conditions, of different social fractures. And our book brings this out. And I'll mention just the United States. Our so-called revolution in the United States was caused not only by the Vietnam War or the context created by the young Vietnam War. For young people like myself, I was anti-war protester. But why? Not simply because I knew it was wrong, but also because I had a good chance of getting drafted and being sent abroad to die. It's that simple. That helped to bring young people together. But also, in understanding this period, there were other factors. One that is sometimes slighted or gets put second next to the Vietnam War is the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Movement was enormously powerful because it raised issues that were more than transitional, or that were more than temporary. So the Vietnam War ended, but the issue of civil rights did not end. And the issues that were involved in the civil rights movement in the 1960s have been embedded in our culture, and you could say are expressed today in very unfortunate ways. But one of the reasons that you have such a virulent opposition to the idea that all human beings are created equal in the United States is because the whole theme is part of our culture now. And like I said about my students, they take this theme for granted, or they accept it, and they do have the idea that people should be treated equally. So what's happened is we're seeing the explosion, unfortunately, in the United States, of this particular conflict over values and ideas. But again, to bring me back to the first point and stop, the problem is, where is the project? Where's the urgency for this young generation? It doesn't appear to be there.
But I have only one last question for Volker and one for you. For you is, what do you think? Obviously, the human rights movement was also becoming something bigger than the U.S. Afro-American question, because it enters Latin America, enters the Vietnam War, Indonesia, etc., etc. But do you think, do you agree with me that the experience of the changing of the decade between the 60s and the 70s also contribute for sometimes, almost, to change the idea of Latin America like something exotic? Latin America is part of a global world, of a complex Western world. And it's not something exotic, the South, as usually considered in some North American imaginaries talking about Mexico, underdevelopment countries, but it's part of this complexity of the Western world. That's the question for you. And the question for Volker is about the role of cinema in this globalization of the imaginaries that come between the 60s and the 70s. What do you think about the role of cinema and the new cinema that are coming, for example, from Latin America and Asia, that are also changing the idea, for example, the changing of the images of the Native Americans in the Western movies in the US, the European cinema, all this changing of imaginaries that in this complex transformation of the decades are becoming something real.
Jim, you first.
We can't hear you. We can't hear you, James.
About Latin America, the point of our book was to include Latin America. And, you know, I know from the perspective of our contributors and all of my friends in Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, and elsewhere, that their experience, they would like for their experience and their perspectives to be taken seriously. But Massimo, you would know better than I about the actuality of that today. You know, when Americans or when Europeans are thinking about these big questions, do they think about Latin America?
Talking about 73 crisis, sometimes we forget the impact of the copper crisis of Chile that was maybe bigger as the oil crisis of the Middle East, but in the European imaginaries, only the oil crisis of Middle East enter the copper crisis of Chile in the age that starting the technological revolution, the cybernetic transformation wasn't considered so much. And also the historian have a sort of complex vision of these changes. So I agree with you about this. Volker?
Well, when I remember the 60s, I think first about, is my mic on? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Funny. it's all on. Well, I hope you can hear me. Is that in fact, before cinema helped the revolution, so to speak, it was the aesthetics of cinema that were revolutionized. 1957, I remember the first films of Ingmar Bergman arriving in Paris, seeing the first films of Jean Rouch, the ethnologue, become filmmaker. And that was a radical break from every aesthetic of cinema that we had known before. And even Godard and Truffaut made their first shorts in 1958-59. So before the content changed, the form changed. The cinema got revolutionized. And then later with Prima della Rivoluzione or Pasolini and others, and the Cinema Novo, they picked it up and they had a new form with a new content. And if you ask if that could happen today, I don't really think so, because the digital revolution kind of finished once and for all cinema as we knew it. It's where a group of people place. Everybody is living in a continuous audiovisual diarrhea being shed upon them. But that may lead to exchanges and to building of groups, because I've just been the last 3 years on and off working on a documentary in Africa and the sub-Saharan, in the Sahel zone, in 6 of these 11 countries. And when we said a little earlier, well, there is no youth anymore, well, just turn to Africa. There is a lot of youth, 80% of them. And they all have a cell phone. Only 30% have electricity. So they somehow live in the dark, except for their cell phone. And in each village, there is just one solar panel to alimент the batteries of the cell phone. But there is a change in the move. And my feeling was, it may not yet be articulated as a revolutionary impatience, but these 100 millions, they're right now 1.2 billion Africans, and they will double within the next 30 years. There's nothing to do because no family planning was done. So this is inevitable. It's too late to stop it now. So they have this problem on the one side, and they are the first victims of climate change. Which they do not yet entirely attribute to our industries and to our behavior, but the connection will be made soon, I'm sure. And even in the northern hemisphere, there is this growing impatience about the youth, not so much now maybe for social causes anymore, but for the climate causes and for the environment causes. And a mockery like this, what I would call the summit of shame, the so-called climate summit of last week, where a lot of expectations were risen and nothing was fulfilled. Well, that will contribute to sooner or later an upheaval of another generation. So far, my prophecy.
Thank you very much, Volker. And you are totally right. In the last week, we have a couple of Mayan artists from South Mexico here in our university, Ulm. And before returning to Mexico, they told me that they were impressed from how many old people they have seen in Milan. They are not used to see so many old people.
Just look at us.
Yeah. Yes. So that's a big issue about the changes. And only to, as a witness, I would like to thank James because of the democratic process of the building of this book, because also the introduction was part of a dialogue, of big dialogue between different perspectives. So I think that's not so usual to have a book so collective in many ways. Apart, but you are the editor, obviously, but it was a very collective effortness. So I think, I don't know if you have any questions in the public. We have many young students here, so that's a good news that came here. I don't know if someone would ask something. And we also thank the translator, because we have the Italian and the English channel of the conference. So, no one tried to ask something? Right. We have the youngest of all. This.
Devo pensare. Mi dice al volo il titolo del libro?
Global 68.
Ok.
In Europe and Latin America.
Ok. La domanda è questa: sulla base delle vostre esperienze, pensate quello che è successo nel 68, che voi avete riportato, stia in qualche modo ripresentandosi oggi, e se sì, con che diversità? Chiaro?
We have two questions, now they're coming.
So based on your experiences, do you think that what happened in 1968 in a way happens today as well? And if yes, how is this happening?
We can pick both. But you have to use your microphone, sorry. Is it?
Scusate. No, so I mean, I think that in a way the two guests from abroad have already answered to this question, but I mean in two different ways, because I mean Volker, I think that in a way he has seen something that is really not so visible, but very strong. This idea that I mean Africa is really is today the young continent, so in a very strong way. And I mean it's not only it's not only a problem, it's also a resource, because I mean it's a continent in which there is a lot of production of new ideas. For instance, under the point of view of art, cinema, fashion, there is amazing what is going on there. There is a magazine called Natal that maybe you should really is online. You should look at. It's called the Natal. It's a magazine produced in Lagos, Nigeria, and Cape Town, South Africa. And it collects all the avant-garde in Africa. It's amazing. It's an amazing, and you can see how much. I mean, music, for instance, of course, as always, but fashion, art, videos. There is a lot of stuff coming out of Africa right now. A lot of production of local. The production of movies, of videos, of serials in Nigeria this year has become much bigger than the production in Hollywood. So it's not what is called the Nollywood. So I mean, it's very interesting that that there is a strong youth, and maybe the next wave will come from there. Absolutely, because. They are really the funny thing is that we don't see it in Italy. We don't see it, at least here in Italy. For the rest, I don't know. I think that in a way, the other terrible thing is that one of the heritage of our generations, of the elders, is a lot of skepticism and pessimism. So that is a really, I mean, it's a shame because, you know, for instance, having worked with Ivan Illich, in the last years, Illich was really pessimistic. And I think that many of these thinkers have really lost any kind of hope. So, and this is also part of the suicide of the elders. So this idea that, okay, the world is not going according to our hopes, so the world is going down the tubes. So it's I mean, you find it in a lot of I mean, in Italy, Bifo is totally is in delirium, no? So that I mean, it's really, everything is fucked up. The only thing we can do is just waiting for the end, you know. That is crazy because of course this is also what in a certain way the industrial economy wants, no? This kind of general suicide. And this is not what the new generation wants. So for the first time, and again, we have a totally different interest because of course the elders just wait to die, and the new generations, they don't want to die. So this can be a big gap.
We have another question. Let me reframe just a little the question in English, and probably because my discipline is different, I would like only to receive yes or no. The question is this: do you think, for the people here and the people online, do you think that keyword like dream, destiny, that was the keyword, some of the keyword used in the 60s, today for the young generation, dream, destiny have the same value? Yes or no? Thanks.
There is an... yeah, to left. So we lost him. So I try to answer for my part. There is a very good rock British band that I really love that are called Marillion, that some years ago made an album called Fuck Everyone and Run. And the acronym of Fuck Up Everyone and Run was fear. Fear was the key words of this album. But after that album, they made another album that will be in some months, that will be called 1 Hour Before It's Dark. That it's something that you say to young boys to come back home when they are outside of the home. But on the other side, it's something that rebuild a little bit of hope. I think that in some places of the world, in Latin America, a part of violence, narcos, and a lot of terrible things, there is a little bit more of hope than in some other parts of the old war. That's a big issue. I don't know about the US. I think the pandemic also introduced something about this that would be really interesting to compare perspective of the pandemic, talking also about some other encounters in this festival, Book City, that were about the pandemic, books about pandemics, for example.
Super clear, like always. I think it's nice too, because for me, dream and destiny that they use today is much more close to what you mentioned, fear. Even if they use the same keyword, but 15 years ago was a kind of future, no? Something like we can do it. Today is fear, but it's only a point of view. Thanks.
Can I? You have another question?
But if I can throw in a word, the word I use with my students now is hope, which is it's a very Catholic idea, but much more. And it's very easy for people to look at the world, and especially young people, and to think that the choice is between optimism and pessimism. And certainly, there are a lot of things that you can be pessimistic about today, particularly our politics, our societies. And it's certainly harder to find room for optimism. We only have to think about the climate summit. But hope is a wonderful concept. And what goes along with it, of course, is, and this is my message to young people, determination. Our generation didn't do a great job sorting out the kinds of problems we wanted to fix. Also, we've been succeeded by generations that seem to go in the wrong direction. But I think if young people have hope, and at the same time they combine it with determination, then there's good reason to think we'll move forward.
If the way the discussion has been going, which is kind of interesting that only the gray-haired people in the audience here or are saying something about what youth is expressing today. So I'm a little bit skeptical about that approach, but okay, I mean, the question is good, you know, but this brings me to a point drawing back the attention to the moment of 68 in a broader sense, and that is that in my view, the 1968 revolts, let's call them, were really unusual in various ways, but one element of it, which I do not see emphasized often enough, is that it actually happened in the middle of plenty, in the middle of a very positive economic growth period in the world, and well, certainly in Europe in the first world, but that's where the attention has been often of 68. So unlike virtually all other revolutions or revolts, and again, I apologize for being mostly focused on Europe, but you know, Europe is quite big in and of itself. Most other, virtually all, probably all other revolutions I can think of in European history came in the middle or at the end of big world wars or such cataclysms, or they came in the course of a massive economic crisis or depression. 1968 was really the first one which came, in that sense, completely unexpected. It came out of the blue. You know, people were doing well every year. You made a little bit more money. Things looked good. There was optimism all around. The American century, you know, which of course I use as a cynical expression, but it meant something for people. So it was, you know, the young people demonstrating in the streets were the first TV generation. You know, I mean, they were used to positive developments in society and economy, etc. Nonetheless, something happened like 1968. So it's a highly unusual context, which explains, I think, in part, the great amount of optimism in 68, because people didn't, you know, they didn't become militants out of necessity in that sense, in that straightforward economic sense. And if I can just add one more point to something here, our colleague anthropologist said, on the point of youth being so central, which is of course the fact back in the 60s. But let me say that from my point of view, it's not so much, I think, that sociologically speaking, youth were more numerous as such in Europe or the world, but they were more visible. And this has to do with the fact that, again, it's part of that, the context of 68 happening after about 20 years of seemingly everlasting progressive economic and social changes, is the moment from the 50s onwards, is the first moment in history that in the first world, to use that term, you had the development of a category of analysis on sociologies called youth. There were really no mainstream youth studies prior to the 50s because people, you know, the average person, leaving aside a few aristocrats who could always afford to have a youth experience, it was really only from the 50s onwards that young people actually had some years in which they could be young, neither a child nor an adult. I mean, something in between. So that is a new experience. You have also the incredible multiplication of university students, which is only a small fraction of youth, but nonetheless a very important element of the youth experience in 1968. In virtually every single country, again I use the term first world, you have a doubling, tripling, quadrupling, sextupling of university students in the course of 10, 15 years. Unprecedented. Yeah. Never happened before, never happened again. So these are some of the concrete contexts which made 68 into a highly unusual moment. Last point, if I can say, is, again, this is not meant as a real deep-going critique, but when you said there were no gurus, well, I'm not so sure. There were, if you look at the various protest movements, the student movements, etc., of 68 and 69 and so forth, there were very few, oftentimes self-appointed spokespersons who were the ones the media turned to when they needed to talk to someone, you know, who pointed out the point of view of students. It's always the same people, and let me add that 99% of them were male. I've tried to come up with top-level spokespersons for the student movements of the late 60s in Europe or North America, and the only one I can really think of who really became the most prominent spokesperson of a student generation in her part of the world was Bernadette Devlin in Northern Ireland. She's the only one who had that status in the student movement. All the other ones were male. Male doesn't mean that they're necessarily gurus, but there is an element, of self-appointed self-importance. But okay.
Thank you, Gerd. And in the Italian case, many of the protesters were the first of their family to enter to a university. That was part of this picture. So I think we have arrived at the end of this discussion. And thank you very much to all the organizer of the Book City Festival here in Newell, our students, and our guests, Volker, James, and see you the next time. And
Thank you. Thanks for including me.
Thank you very much, James. Cheers. Grazie. Buona serata.